Well, good evening and welcome to the GSC Grays webinar for January 2022. Today we are going to be talking through various updates in the various different elements of the main farming sectors in this region. Firstly, Sam and Josh will be talking about the arable sector, followed on by Laura about the beef and sheep, and then Greg is going to cover off the dairy, poultry and pigs. You'll see a sixth person sitting here, Holly Story. Holly's going to join us at the end for questions, but before that, I'll be talking through regenerative farming and trying to bring everything together with summary conclusions. So the first presentation that we're looking at is going to be the economic prospects for arable farming, and we'll start off with Sam.
Thank you very much, Robert. Good evening, everyone. As Rob says, I am going to give us a quick rundown of the arable sector. If I can move on, hopefully. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to start by having a quick look back at Harvest 2021, and then we'll have a quick look forward at Harvest 2022. And then Josh is going to put a bit of meat on the bones in terms of my comments through the use of our model farms. So, looking back at Harvest 2021, to start with, started wet again in the autumn of 2020, as it did the previous year, and translated into a cold spring. A lot of you will remember that sort of April of frost that we had that gave some crops a bit of a knock. But nonetheless, we went on to harvest and progressed as it usually does. Depending on what part of the country you were in, sort of progressed at different levels. The eastern regions of the country seemed to get a few more showers than others, but generally speaking, progressed well. And likewise, yields and quality were up, certainly on the back of the previous year. And couple that with good prices, it was generally speaking a good harvest for most. And to put that into a bit of context, provisionally for Harvest 2021, wheat yields nationally were back up above 14 million tonnes, which was 45% up on the previous year. So as a bit of a summary of Harvest 2021, decent yields, decent quality coupled with strong prices, I think it's fair to say we can expect, or we have seen, good profitability in the arable sector for Harvest 2021. Looking forward, Harvest 2022, well, generally speaking, most winter crops have been established well. The weather was generally kind to us this autumn just gone, and it even allowed beet and potatoes to be lifted in good conditions and that land to be drilled as well. Obviously, input costs are soaring for 2022. There's no two ways about that, unfortunately, whether that be fertilizer, seed, pesticides or machinery, everything seems to be going up, and likewise actually getting the stuff on farm seems to be an issue as well. Forward prices remain strong, but my final point there, we can't talk about farming seemingly without talking about the weather. Arable farming's no different to that, and we've still got a long way to go between now and Harvest 2022, and I've no doubt the weather will play a part in that. We'll just have to hope it's kind, but there is nothing we can do about that. So moving forward, just to sort of put some figures next to the good prices that I've talked about, that's quite a good snapshot of the prices that we have had available to us for Harvest 2021. So if we look at those January 2022 figures, all well up on the previous year, and likewise looking forward to January 2023. The future prices that are available for Harvest 2022 crop, and I think as a start of a marketing campaign, fixing some wheat at the north side of £200 a tonne wouldn't be a bad start at all. And I dare say that figure might have gone up a little bit today, just on the back of what's going on in Russia and the Ukraine. Now, that's obviously a very nice slide to look at. This next slide, unfortunately, is less kind. But is obviously having a massive impact on the sector and the industry. So yeah, everything on that list has gone up considerably since the previous year. And it's not just the price either, it's getting the stuff on farm, unfortunately, that seems to be the issue. You know, if fertilizer isn't on farm currently, it's going to be hard pushed, I would say, to get it on farm for when crops are starting to want it. You know, we're getting towards the back end of January now. Depending on what the weather does in the next month or so, some crops might be looking for their first application of nitrogen fertilizer. And again, just to sort of highlight the size of this issue, not too long ago, nationally, there was about 40% of farms that didn't have the majority of their ammonium nitrate fertilizer on farm. So that's you know, that's a lot of fertilizer to find and to get on farm in a very small space of time. So that's all I really wanted to say. As I say, as a bit of a conclusion, harvest 2021, good yields, or certainly improved yields, coupled with strong prices. We've seen some good profitability. Harvest 2022, there's certainly the potential there. You know, we've got some good plantings in the ground. Forward prices remain strong. And if you've got a shed full of fertilizer already, bought early at that £300 a tonne mark, better still. But I will pass on to my colleague now, Josh, and he'll add to that even further. So, Josh, I will pass on to you.
Many thanks, Sam. Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's well. I'll just give you a quick rundown of, firstly, our model farms. So it's very exciting, fresh off the press. We have created a series of model farms. We've created a dairy model, arable, a lowland beef and sheep, and an upland beef and sheep model. We have prepared them using realistic and up-to-date prices based on typical systems, if there is such thing in our industry, of each sector. The aim for the model farms is to show the effects of market trends, policy changes, the effects of environmental schemes on farm profitability, to help make sustainable business decisions. Firstly, or what I will be looking at, should I say, is the arable farm model. So what we've based this on is a 250 hectare model, 240 hectares under cropping, 90 hectares tenanted under an FBT, which looking at predominantly a whole host of our clients. That is sort of a typical system around sort of the location we're in here, sort of in the Midlands and further north. The crop rotation, pretty standard crop rotation: winter wheat, winter barley, and oilseed rape. Typical yields: 9.5 tonnes a hectare for wheat, 8.4 tonnes a hectare for barley, and 3.7 for oilseed rape. We have gone with 2 family members plus 1 harvest casual, the 2 family members being sort of the farmer in post and the next generation. What I will now move on to is looking at our projections and budget actual for the 2021 harvest. As you can see from this slide here, we have seen, from what Sam said, good yields and quality, strong prices, which has left us quite a reasonable business surplus at the bottom line there, following sort of drawings and tax as well, at £452 a hectare, which has shown some good business profit over the last sort of 12 months. Moving forward, again, given what Sam said, looking at input prices soaring, and reducing support, we sort of see it as a 3-stage process, or a 3-scenario projection, should I say. So projection 1, as you can see on the screen there, that is ammonium nitrate fertilizer priced at £300 a tonne. There's a good proportion of sort of British agricultural businesses that are in that situation, which, if you are, that's good. The second projection is exactly the same costs otherwise, but fertilizer priced at £620 a tonne. Again, a good proportion of UK agriculture are also in that situation. What we are tending to see, and looking at budgets going forward, is from the second projection, the £620 a tonne fertilizer price in there, the business surplus reduces significantly from the sort of the fertilizer price of £300 a tonne. This is promoting conversation with businesses and agronomists at applying sort of a break-even ratio, which is the economic optimum based on fertilizer price and grain price. That is, in sort of layman's terms, the reduction ever so slightly of application before there is a significant reduction in yield. What we are sort of seeing from our projections utilising that break-even ratio is that business surplus actually increasing itself back up to sort of £208 a hectare. So if you are in a situation, as Sam says, where there is still fertiliser to be bought, or you've bought it at that higher price, the higher average, it may be worthwhile looking at forming a break-even ratio on your crop to sort of increase that gross margin. So this in mind, I've sort of covered what I was wanting to sort of say there. I will pass on to Laura Curitan, who will move on to the beef and sheep sector.
Just very quickly before Laura starts, I do apologise, but one thing I did forget to say at the start is, if you do have any questions, you should see a chat box in the box that's to the side of the screen. If you do have any questions, please put your questions in there, and we will try and answer them at the end of the meeting, if at all possible. Back to Laura.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So good evening, everyone. So firstly, I am going to do a quick roundup of the key headlines that we've witnessed in the beef and sheep industry throughout 2021 and into 2022. So firstly, we noticed that the cold and delayed spring certainly stalled the grass growth, but fortunately, we did get warmer weather after that, allowing grass growth to come through and ample amounts of forage to then be made. We also saw heightened demand for beef and lamb during COVID-19, as the household cooking habits did change throughout that, with more consumers purchasing roasting joints and cuts that they wouldn't otherwise purchase normally. Very evident that now has come back to a more normal level, but the supplies do remain tight, and that's been very evident through the demand and the prices being driven upwards for both beef and lamb. Significantly higher cereal prices. We will all probably have noticed that the concentrate feed prices have risen considerably, and that does continue to rise too. However, ample straw supplies have reduced those straw prices that were very high last year, and I can certainly say that has been very welcomed. So as we can see from this snapshot, it's been a very positive to see the increases in the prices that we've seen recently in comparison to the previous year. So we've had finished steers increased by 11% to 417 pence per kilogram deadweight, finished heifers increasing by 9%, finished young bulls again an increase of 11%, and to highlight, the new season lambs increasing significantly by 30%, taking that price up to 603 pence per kilogram. The second table provides a brief overview of the less positive changes, particularly with the straw and the grain prices there. But it is certainly important to highlight these, with feed barley price increase in around 53%, hay price decrease of 24%, and that barley straw then up by 10%. So from a beef and sheep perspective, with regards to our new model farms, we have produced both a lowland mixed model farm and an upland model farm, and that's to illustrate the performance of similar businesses. Firstly, the lowland mixed farm is 160 hectares. It's a part rented farm that has 120 suckler cows, 450 ewes, and utilises 20 hectares to grow their own feed barley for home use. The results are based on the financial year of year end of 31st of March, so therefore we are currently operating in the 21-22 year. And as you can see, the gross margin, the gross income from production has increased significantly on the previous year, therefore reflecting the strong prices that we've seen for beef and sheep in the past 6 months or 7 months. Variable costs have increased, mainly due to increased prices of feed concentrate, and we're also seeing that significant increase in fertiliser costs within there too. Fixed costs have increased slightly due to the increased fuel and labour costs, And so with this in mind, the margin from production currently shows a positive of £38 per hectare in the projection year, namely due to those prices achieved for beef and sheep. But as we see continued increases in the fixed and variable costings for the budgeted year, as we move across to the right-hand column, the forecast margin from production is likely to fall back to a negative figure. Something that must be highlighted, however, if we look at the support payments in red on the bottom line here, is that BPS now is gradually declining. We are transitioning into the new environmental land management schemes and new support scheme mechanisms, and it's very evident that the beef and sheep systems are highly reliant on those support payments, and this will further be illustrated in the Upland Farm Model 2. But overall, the business surplus is projected as positive in that 21-22 year, but forecast to return to a deficit in the subsequent budget year to minus £17 per hectare as the prices for livestock reduce, variable costs and fixed costs again keep increasing, and those support payments are starting to decrease as well. So the next one is the Upla model. This is a 750 hectare farm, of which 700 hectares are severely disadvantaged area moorland, plus 50 hectares of in-byland as well. 50 native breed suckler cows, 1,200 swallow-day breeding ewes, and overall they're producing store cattle, gimmers, straw and fat lambs. Again, as we saw in the lowland model, we are currently in the projection year of the 2022 year here, and we have seen some, again, fantastic prices achieved for livestock, increasing from around £11 per hectare from the 2020-21 year into the 21-22 year. Variable costs, again, increasing slightly due to those purchased feed inputs being heightened, with a small consideration for an increase in fertiliser cost, but not as much as the lowland model. Fixed costs also increasing to reflect those increasing costs of fuel and labour, and the overall outcome on the margin from production showing a negative figure across all of those years, showing that even in the years where the prices achieved are good, this sector is heavily reliant on support payments to achieve a business surplus after drawings and tax. Therefore, I think that the key point that I really want to highlight here from both of the livestock models is how reliant these sectors are on farming subsidies to maintain a viable farming business. This has also been highlighted in the DEFRA figures for farm business outputs, where those figures also show that LFA grazing livestock and lowland grazing livestock average around 20% of their total revenue being from direct payments alone. And we certainly must ensure that going forward that these businesses are suitably supported by those future schemes, so that they can be resilient to the change throughout the agricultural transition period and beyond that as well. So with that in mind, I will pass on to Greg, who's going to talk to us about dairy.
Thank you, Laura. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just pick up the presentation. So as Laura said, I'm just going to touch on dairy and then poultry and pigs, the more intensive enterprises. So just firstly with dairy, 4 key issues really affecting dairy businesses at the moment. Obviously input costs, as with every other sector, rising quite dramatically. Milk price has risen significantly as well. And it's difficult to know which one's out competing the other at the moment. We'll come back to that in a little while. Other issues affecting dairy farmers, labour availability, that's a bit of a problem for some. Getting good quality labour, attracting the right resources, retaining that labour. And it's probably one of the areas that's perhaps leading some farmers to still consider leaving the industry at the moment. And the other issue which falls into that category is investment costs as well. Many dairy farms probably need a little bit of investment going forward. Most dairy businesses have had or will be having an inspection from Environment Agency, and that's likely to lead to some investment requirements. Coupled with that, with looking to develop for the future, increasing audit standards from milk buyers and those sort of things, the commitment to the future has got to be quite strong. It's not difficult to get to £200,000 or £300,000 worth of investment. And even though there might be some grants available through slurry management grants from DEFRA and the RPA, the costs of investment are significant and require a commitment to the future. So that's a key issue as well. Just coming back to milk price and concentrate feed values, just a graph here over the last 15, 18 months or so of milk price and concentrate feed values. Milk price on a pence per litre basis, concentrates on a pence per kilo basis. The blue line is the milk price and the orange line is concentrate cost. In terms of clearly a real low back in May 2020 for milk producers, this milk price here is very much a non-aligned type milk contract. There's basically two levels of pricing in the dairy sector, it appears to be at the moment. Those on aligned contracts selling to supermarkets who would be on significantly higher levels of milk price than the figures we've got here, and those on non-aligned contracts. Again, I will come back to the difference between the two when we look at our model farm in a moment. But from a low back in May 2020, milk price has risen pretty consistently, and since the autumn of last year, it's risen probably above our expectations actually, or we put this graph together very early December, or late November, and you can see at that time we were sort of a little bit cautious in our view as to which direction milk prices would go. Since early November or early December, prices have strengthened even further, and most milk buyers are implementing price increases through to the spring with an expectation that most milk producers will be on something of the order of 35 pence a litre, so towards the top end of our pricing here by sort of probably March 2022, a little bit ahead of our figures. Against that, concentrate prices have risen dramatically on the back of higher cereal prices and other protein feeds, and an increase of probably about 7.5 pence a kilo. That translates to probably 2 to 3 pence a litre in terms of the cost of production for milk producers. And then just moving on to look at our dairy model farm, as Josh said, we've put together a number of models. We've got two illustrations with the dairy model, but the only change relates to the difference in milk price. So firstly, a non-aligned milk price, so that's the lower end of milk prices that we would see, but not untypical. Significant number of producers across Yorkshire and the northeast of England on those kind of prices. Our dairy model is based on a 165 hectare unit, that's 400 acres or so, with 260 cows and probably producing around about 8,500 litres per cow from memory. If we focus in on 2020 and 2021 financial year, the second column from the left in terms of the numbers, and particularly looking at milk price, which was around about 25.5 pence a litre. Again, I would say that was a very typical average milk price for that year, experienced by a lot of producers on these contracts. Take off the costs for variable costs, fixed costs, and add in the support payments. We are there is a profit there of 2.8 pence a litre, but we need to take out of that drawings and tax. We've included provision of 3 pence a litre. That might be more or less on different farms depending on the labour structure. Here we've got an owner-occupier plus one member of staff and some other family labour as well. But I think that model, those figures for 2020, 2021 are very reflective of what we've seen on a lot of farms. So about a break-even position at best. Moving forward into the current milk year through to March 2022, prices have, as we've seen, increased, and they've increased ahead of the cost rises increase. And so we're looking at sort of a projection with 2.5 pence a litre margin after all costs, including drawings and tax. And then looking forward further into 2022-23, so the next financial year from April onwards. Again, I think these figures, just as we stand at the moment, are probably looking a little bit cautious. We've got a milk price of 32.7 pence a litre. It could well be above that, but we do tend to take a cautious view of things. And by the time we add in some other costs, although milk price is rising or expected to rise, our margin overall 2.5 pence a litre, the same as the current year that we're in. And looking even further ahead, and some might criticise us or take a view that we've been a little bit too cautious, but we're just factoring in a slightly lower milk price and the business surplus of 2 pence a litre. But overall, our view and our expectation for the industry is much more positive than it has been over the year to March 2021. Perhaps a key thing to focus on is cost of production, the top line on our graph. And from 1920, that was around about 29.6 pence, rising to a peak in 22-23 on our model farm of 34.9 pence. So a rise of 5.3 pence, significant rises as they stand. Just moving the same figures on, but with a different type of contract, so an aligned supermarket type contract, or for more typically for those in Yorkshire and the North East selling into Arla, who are without doubt paying the best price of the milk buyers that I come across. And we can see what a significant improvement or that has on the bottom line in terms of the returns and the margins achieved. So overall, that's a pretty positive position. Obviously, one can't very easily influence who one sells to, and that this is quite a big issue for the industry as a whole in terms of the difference that has been apparent, albeit that difference in price has perhaps been squeezed more recently. I think just to conclude on the dairy sector, our view is we are in for a more positive period, and I think that's important. The industry needs it, and I will now move on to poultry and pigs. So just having a look at some figures for broilers. These are just figures for cost of production, comparison between November 2020 and November 2021. And we can see here significant increases in, well, firstly, there's an increase in the sale price achieved and therefore the value of chicken of 9%, but much higher costs for chick cost and feed, up by 7% and 13% respectively. And then these figures don't include any increase for other costs, which I think actually now is probably becoming a little bit outdated again. And I would suspect the cost inflation is coming into the medicines and vaccines, other variable costs and overhead costs, and perhaps that's probably putting a little bit more pressure on margins than we're seeing here. So quite a change, a reduction in margins achieved, and a reduction of 26% there, so quite significant in that respect. In terms of the situation for free-range egg producers, this has been quite a difficult sector for a period of time. Egg price probably hasn't been quite good enough, in my opinion. And again, obviously the sector is experiencing some quite significant inflationary increases in cost. And although the price has risen by 10% here, the actual net margin hasn't really changed, a small deficit. And it really does depend in these situations a lot on how much investment has taken place and how recently, as to the level of things like loan repayments that producers have got to fund out of the returns that they're getting, and the overhead costs, although that does include some provision for loan repayments and depreciation, it will not reflect accurately what might be found on any particular farm. So in terms of the future for free-range egg producers, all the supermarkets have made a commitment to focus on free-range or organic egg production for the longer term, with a deadline really of 2025 to get for that change to be implemented. The majority of egg production is already free range, something like 24 million hens, but there's still a number of colony or caged units around, making up about 13 million hens in total. So there will be some change in this sector, and that could be a positive factor in terms of influencing price and pushing the price upwards as we move forward to 2025. One or two of my colleagues have already questioned earlier on whether actually the move to free range really just sets the sort of default bar in terms of that's the system that has to be implemented. I think that probably is in reality already the case. We've not seen any investment in colony egg production recently. It's all been free range systems, but hopefully a little bit more positive expectation for the future there in terms of impact on price. Just touching on pigs, this really is a pretty difficult situation. I think everybody will be aware of that. It's been well documented in the press, situation on farms, falling output prices coming into 2021, and they've continued through to now. Feed cost has risen just as it has for every other enterprise, livestock enterprise on farm. There's been some oversupply of pigs, and pigs held back on farm for quite considerable periods. One of my clients was had 25% of their pigs held back for something like 8 to 12 weeks in the autumn of 2021. That led to pigs becoming heavier weights, and then obviously a higher volume of pork going off to the processor when they're actually sold and slaughtered. So clearly some major issues here. Slaughtering and processing capacity has been an issue. And although there's been some government support, I think we would suggest it's been relatively moderate, really just around processing capacity and private storage aid. And perhaps if we just, on our last set of figures, look at the margins that have been achieved, or perhaps more importantly, the deficit more latterly, I think it is important to focus on the situation with pigs probably for 7 or 8 years. I think for up till 2019 actually was quite a positive position. There was 1 year, I think 2016, where prices were poor, but on balance, producers had quite a good run for a reasonable period of time. The orange line here is the price for pigs. The sorry, I beg your pardon, the blue line is the price for pigs. The block graphs are the costs of production broken down into the various component parts, including feed and other costs. And the orange line is the margin, and then the deficit more latterly that's been achieved. And if we look back to Q1 last year, a loss of £30 a pig, that's a significant figure. And I think in relation to pig price, which is probably back at not dissimilar levels now to where it was at that time, around about 143 to 146 pence a kilo, we're probably looking at quite significant deficits again just at the moment. So it is a difficult period. There's no getting away from that. So just to summarize on the individual sectors before I hand over to Robert. Clearly, input costs have risen significantly across all sectors. But I think we would say for arable producers, beef and lamb and dairy farmers, actually output prices have remained strong, and that's been a real positive and helped maintain and in fact improve margins over the last year or so. We've obviously touched on pigs and the situation there, which is very difficult. Laura mentioned about declining basic payments, and that again is quite significant for a lot of farming businesses. So in our view, we've got volatility and uncertainty. That seems to have been a feature of the marketplace for some period of time, and we expect it to continue to be so. I suppose if we look at it in one way, volatility, we need a little bit of volatility to get prices up in certain sectors, and that's certainly evidenced by milk, and arable and beef and lamb, and that's a positive thing. The uncertainty obviously comes with rising costs or potentially declining prices for the future. So with that, I think Robert will come back to this at the end of our talk, but I will hand over to Robert, who's going to talk about regenerative farming.
Thank you very much, Greg. And we will hopefully move the slide on. There we go. So we thought it would be quite useful to actually give people our understanding of what everyone is talking about in the industry, or an awful lot of people are talking about in the industry in terms of regenerative farming, and our take in it, and possibly the reason why people are looking at it as a potential way of altering their businesses going forward. The 5 principles of regenerative farming are given there below. Avoid soil disturbance. Try and minimize the amount of soil that you move when you're actually establishing crops. By doing that, you preserve the soil structure and you preserve the mycorrhizal fungi, which is the network of fungi that is throughout the soil. And the less movement of soil that you do, the more of that actually is maintained and is able to continue to grow. Maintain soil cover. Keeping soil cover, or maintaining a cover on the soil, reduces erosion, reduces runoff, and actually helps increase infiltration of rainwater into the soil. Keeping living roots in the soil, basically trying to have something growing in the soil for 12 months of the year. That improves the soil structure over time, and there's various things called root exudates that are excreted from the roots of all plants, which again helps improve the diversity or the biodiversity underneath the ground. Growing a diverse rotation of crops. That's probably one of the reasons I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. But growing a diverse rotation of crops produces a greater diversity below the ground, because there's roots that are actually utilizing different areas of the soil profile every point of the time. And the final point is to integrate livestock into crop production. Increasing organic matter levels in the soil is actually one of the main issues that will actually enhance the overall biodiversity and soil health. So we're going to look at different sections. We're looking at the arable enterprise to start with, and then we'll come on to the livestock side of things. So in the arable enterprise, the whole essence of no-till drilling is to try and minimize the amount of soil that is disturbed. Using cover crops is going to become an integral part of those no-till systems, and actually altering the crop rotation will also be a significant part of the decision-making process. So what do we have? We've got a few pictures here. So for those of you that aren't aware, that is what a no-till drill looks like. And this is what it creates. It doesn't look very pretty, or certainly if you're used to seeing a plowed field and a very tidy field with nothing up above the ground once the crop's been sown, you'll be sadly disappointed. And if you're driving around the countryside in the autumn, you might well have seen fields that look like that, which then turn into this as the crop's starting to get established. And as you will see there, one of the issues there is you'll see that the actual row spacings, or the width between the rows of plants, is actually quite a lot wider than normal conventional drills. That is purely to allow the trash from the first couple of photos there to actually move through the drill and not actually cause problems when drilling the crop. And if it's done right, we end up with a crop that actually you can't really see an awful lot of difference with between by the time the actual ears come out later in the season. Cover crops are basically going to be essential there, because quite often you will actually have to alter your rotation, because certain crops you will struggle to actually establish within a regenerative farming rotation. Winter barley is probably the main one. You will struggle to establish that purely because of the fact of the amount of wheat volunteers that will occur from the previous crop, which you are unable to control in the winter barley crop. But the aim would be, as soon as the previous crop is up, we get a cover crop in the ground. So there's just a picture of a few plants just immediately after, or very closely after drilling. And then they'll end up into situations like that. And the whole essence of the cover crop is the fact that it is actually soaking up nutrients from within the ground, but it's actually also soaking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sucking that down into the soil and sequestering carbon, which is also something that has become one of the areas that people are seriously looking at. In terms of our diverse crop rotations, you will find that people are looking at growing an awful lot of different crops. Here is a client where they've actually brought clover into the rotation to actually, again, improve the actual soil health, improve the biodiversity, improve the amount of carbon sequestration, and actually enable them to actually alter their livestock enterprise to actually increase the profitability there. And then also probably increasing the use of spring crops. So this one was a no-till crop of spring barley. It might not look particularly clever at that particular point in time, but at the end of the year, it actually still yielded over 3 tons an acre, which the client was very happy with. In terms of the livestock side of things, there's 2 elements to it, or the two main elements I'm going to be talking about is mob grazing, paddock grazing, and then also the use of forage crops. So what we're meaning by mob and paddock grazing is basically we're emulating emulating nature. If you think of the African plains, the zebras and such like wildebeest, they basically move across the plains. They're eating a bit of vegetation, moving on, eating some fresh vegetation each day. They're not like what historically we have done in this country, where the livestock are put in a field at the start of the summer and often stay there throughout the actual grazing season. And if you actually look at the response to this with this slide, where the only 50% of the plant material is actually eaten, it doesn't actually impact on the root systems at all. The root systems continue to grow and develop, and that enables a crop to actually continue to sequester carbon, to continue soaking up nutrients, and will actually allow the actual plant growth above ground to recover very quickly. If you actually eat further into that plant growth, and you reducing or taking off 70% of the plant material, that starts to have an impact on the roots. The roots slow down, they actually stop growing after a period of time, and then it takes an awful long time for that plant to recover to produce more growth going forward. And if you really turn it down to the fact that you actually nail the grass sward to the ground, and the sheep and cattle are literally eating their toes, that really does impact on the root system. The roots stop, and it takes an awful long time for the plants to recover. And that's a typical picture of what happens in a mob or paddock grazing situation. You have an awful lot of animals in a relatively small area for a relatively short period of time before they move on to the next field of pasture and gradually move their way around the farm. In terms of the diversified forage crops, again, the aim of that is to actually provide vegetation that the animals can eat. You're actually looking at trying to encourage the actual root growth there, and that slide that you're seeing there is a chicory plant, and it just shows the significant amount of root growth that can occur from these forage crops, which will be to the benefit of both the ground but also to the animals themselves. By growing these forage crops, it actually will enable animals to stay outside for longer. It actually allows the grass area to be rested for a period of time, ready to be grazed later on, either later on in the winter or in the spring. But it actually also allows significant savings to be made, because if you don't have animals inside, you reduce the amount of straw, you reduce the amount of labor required, you reduce the amount of health problems you have, all of which potentially will save you money and improve the overall biodiversity of the farm. So in summary, the environmental implications of the regenerative farming techniques, we're looking at expectations of significant improvements in soil health and also livestock health. We go back to the actual grazing elements, where animals are grazing fresh ground on a regular basis. That is immediately resulting in improved livestock health, because they're not actually having to eat around the feces of other animals that might be carrying some form of infection. It increases the biodiversity, both above ground and below ground. There's less runoff from water, there's less erosion, and as a result, less flooding. It also reduces the amount of greenhouse gas emissions because of the fact that the soil isn't actually being moved. As soon as the soil is being moved, it releases carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide back into the atmosphere. And actually, by the fact that there are plants growing in the ground 365 days of the year, a lot of the time not actually being grazed by anything but rested, they're actually able to sequester an awful lot of carbon back down into the soil. And that then leads forward to the financial elements. There is potentially, and there is evidence of this, that there is reductions in labour and machinery costs as a result of going down this route. We're certainly, after a period of time, we're certainly able to see reductions in arable variable costs. Fertilizer usage, there's certainly evidence where people have been practicing these techniques for 5, 6, 7 years, that we're seeing fertilizer applications going down by 30%. And also there's now evidence to show that the pesticide usage is also being reduced. The best analogy I can give you there is related to the common cold. If you are in rude health and you get a cold, you can fight it off quite easily. If you are under the weather, you actually, and you get the same level of infection, you are likely to be hit quite hard and take a longer time to recover. So if you've actually got a healthy soil and a healthy environment, you are more likely to be able to cope with various infections from diseases. In terms of the livestock, we're looking at, again, savings in the variable costs by utilizing the forage for a longer periods of time, enabling to keep livestock outside for longer periods of time. You're reducing the amount of hard feed that you're having to buy, reducing the amount of straw you're having to buy, reducing the amount of vet and med you're having to buy, and also eventually you will actually see reductions in the actual fertilizer usage as well. So that's both benefits to the individual business, but also partly by the reason why the government is going down the direction of travel it is. There's much greater potential savings for the wider economy in terms of clean water and reduced flooding, all of which will benefit other parts of the economy. So, a few comments to finish. It isn't for everyone, and actually not all soil types lend themselves to this system. And there is a cost to moving to this system. Certainly the evidence that we've seen with clients that have moved across, there is a definite cost to it in the first few years. However, over time, there do appear to be significant benefits, both financial and environmental, and potentially the benefits might be even greater financially, depending on the direction of the actual funding that might come through from various government schemes going forward. It makes the land and actually makes the business more resilient, certainly to changeable weather and certainly to price fluctuations. It leads to reduced greenhouse gas emissions, which is a good thing, and also increases the amount of carbon sequestration that can occur, which potentially might lead to additional income streams further down the line. So that's to summarize the whole level of presentations and a few final thoughts from me before we have some questions. As we've already heard across all the various different sectors, input costs are rising significantly in all areas. Fertilizer, feed, all those areas are rising significantly. However, for a good number of the enterprises, output prices remain strong. And actually, as a result of the output prices remaining where they are compared to the actual increase in costs, the margin from production is actually likely to be as high as it's ever been, because the increase in income is greater than the actual additional costs that are being incurred. Against that, basic payments are reducing, and certainly farmers that are listening to this will have seen reductions in their BPS payments this last year, and we'll see further reductions over the next few years. Business need to accept that there is change is required if they are going to have a viable future going forward. And in our opinion, if you do nothing, that is not an option. There is only one direction that you're going, and it's likely to be out of the industry. So what people are doing, or what are we coming across in our working lives? Many businesses have accepted there needs to be a mindset change. People are looking for new ideas, new practices, new ventures, new income streams, potentially looking at joint ventures as well. almost certainly there'll be some involvement with countryside stewardship and various environmental projects over time. But there are a few out there, hopefully none of the people that are listening to this webinar, who are either unaware or feel that they aren't in a position to change. So we've got a challenge, and it's a challenge that all of us that are listening to this and all of us at GSC Grays are keen to look to do. We're doing an awful lot of looking at, farmers should be looking at their businesses to identify opportunities, to identify where they might be weaker than they should be. What can they do to actually improve their business, to actually make it more fit for purpose going forward? Because at the end of the day, we are going to be farming in a much more unsubsidized system than we have been used to all the time that I've been doing this job. And we as a consultancy firm are going to be an integral part of a lot of people's decision making over the next few years as to how they move from the current system to the new system. 2022 will see new schemes. There's various, the Sustainable Farming Incentive for one is starting up this year. And as a result, there are going to be new opportunities out there for people in a whole host of different ways. It might be, and I wouldn't include an opportunity being actually deciding to actually leave the industry, retire from the industry, and potentially let someone else take their place who is prepared to embrace the change. We do look forward to working with you to support farmers in our region and to embrace the future, because it is going to be a fascinating and exciting time over the next few years. And at this point, we're going to bring everyone back onto the screen now, and Josh is going to actually act as chairman to answer the questions that have been presented over the last hour or so. So over to you, Josh.
Perfect. Thank you, Robert, and thank you all. Extremely thought-provoking by the looks of the questions that have come in. So I will make a start on asking them now. So the first one we have is, you talk about the benefits to soil health and indicate areas of likely savings. Are you able to quantify this in more detail?
Right. Where do we go? Well, we start at the top. From a yield point of view, there's probably actually going to be a slight decrease in yield initially, but that does appear to come back. So we've got a slight, you might as well hear warts and all, the pros and cons. So yield is likely to go down a little bit, but it's likely to recover. Seed costs are probably going to be a little bit higher initially, whilst the soil gets used to everything that's going on. Over time, the fertilizer costs are probably going to come down by 30%. In terms of how to quantify that, it all depends on what we actually use on the cost of the fertilizer. But certainly, it's very evident that if the fertilizer remains high in that 500, 600 pounds a ton, that is going to be a significant saving. Labour and machinery costs in general, we're looking at the primary cultivation disappears. So whether that is actually ploughing, or whether that's doing an initial cultivation with some form of cultivator, that disappears. So there's a saving there, which you could argue is probably 40 or 50 pounds a hectare, 20, 25 pounds an acre. So savings are there. It all really depends on the actual system you're doing, how you're having to change the rotation, what changes you can make. So initially there's going to be a cost, then you'll get into a period where it's probably going to be a break-even situation compared to the current system. But over time, it is likely to be that there are going to be financial benefits to doing that, especially if payments from ELMS come in to actually provide an incentive for people to go down that route.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, the second question we have is, how would you look to move towards starting to farm more regeneratively? Probably you again, Robert.
Yeah, me again. From an Alba point of view, where it appears to be most successful is you don't go in trying to do 100% from day one. You start the process gradually, and in general, where it's been most successful is probably following break crops. And when I mean break crops, I'm meaning oilseed rape. I'm meaning probably beans beans and peas if they get harvested soon enough. So purely because of the fact that the soil is probably in the best condition and it can be in the current rotations. So if you start establishing, going down the route of no-till in those following those crops, and then gradually working your way around as those crops work their way around the farm, that is probably going to be the safest route in to that to go down the no-till route.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got another one come in. Will UK milk producers respond to higher milk prices with increased production, therefore putting pressure on milk prices going forward? The dairy question.
Josh, yeah, shall I take that?
You can indeed.
Thank you, Josh. I guess potentially yes. I mean, quite often, what's the response to an increased price for agricultural produce? The reality is many producers look to increase their production. It's a way of making a bit more profit. I suppose at the moment I think there's quite a lot going on across the world, and it's interesting to see how there's relatively small reductions in production and a tightening of supply against some small increases in demand have led to quite a big increase in milk price relatively. So it does highlight how the supply and demand balance can influence the price particularly. And production, I believe, I was reading something earlier on today, is still tight across Europe and the rest of the world. So perhaps we should be a little bit more optimistic for the future that prices will remain strong. I think we would also say, if you look at increasing costs at the moment, we've got to look at farming on the most efficient system that we can, and for dairy farmers that's looking to utilize get as much milk from forage as they possibly can, and looking at other resources in terms of fuel, fertilizer and those kind of things, and using those as efficiently as possible to maximize the margin between the milk price achieved, whatever that is, and the cost structure of the business.
Thank you very much. Sticking again with the livestock theme, we have, what are the most profitable beef and sheep farms doing differently to the average producers?
I'll take that one, if that's all right, Josh.
That's perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Laura.
So I think the key thing really to highlight firstly is that the total expenditure on both the average and the highest performing farms is very similar, but the output for those high performing farms is significantly higher, whether that's in volume of output or the value per unit, or sometimes a mixture of both. So really those high performing farms do have lower overheads overall, showing more efficient uses of capital, but those variable costs are higher due to significant investments that tend to be in the livestock as well. I think for the characteristics of those highest performing businesses that are in the top 25% quartile is going to be, minimizing your overhead costs, so, really focusing on that cost control, but ensuring that your performance isn't compromised at the same time. Other ways of doing that may be collaboration with other local farms, other local businesses, alternatives of maybe looking at your machinery as well, and maintenance costs rather than buying new machinery more frequently. Another way that those highest performing farms are achieving more is by developing short, medium and long-term goals, undertaking regular budgeting exercises as well, including all partners, family, whoever's involved in those discussions at the same time. And then leading on from there, having a really strong business strategy is probably key too. Understanding what your desired outcomes want to be, and then identifying and prioritising tasks to get there is key for those top 25% having a set plan. And then I think finally, we talk about it quite a lot, but benchmarking comes up in most of the sectors too. And using something like Farm Bench that AHDB have, or even just looking in the Farmers Weekly on a regular basis and seeing where the prices are and how that reflects on what your business is achieving as well is really key. And that will identify down the line areas of the farm to you can enhance and be more profitable overall. So that's just a couple of things, but there's probably a longer list if anyone wanted to add anything else to that.
No, I don't think. No, we'll move on. Okay, thank you for that, Laura. The next one we have is, how does the Sustainable Farming Incentive rollout affect the future profitability and management of arable farms? Sam, do you want to kick us off? we can't just hear you.
You're on mute.
Little technical glitch there.
Aha, the organizer had muted me.
Perfect.
I can't be blamed for that one. Holly, feel free to jump in where you want on this one. How will it affect the future profitability and management of arable farms? If we look at what's available through the early rollout, as Rob said, that's going to be available this year, in reality, that for a lot of farmers isn't going to change management practice. You know, creating soil management plans, testing organic matter. A lot of farmers will already be doing that through farm assurance. Likewise, 70% winter cover. Again, in this part of the world where we're managing to get winter crops in early, that'll be covered by that. And likewise, building organic matter of the soil. You know, a lot of mixed farms in the area, or chopping straw, use of cover crops. We should be able to meet those requirements relatively straightforwardly at the moment. Now, obviously, on the other side of that is, because we're able to do that relatively easily, the payment rates are probably reflectant of that. You know, the introductory level, £22 a hectare, and the intermediate level, around £40 a hectare. Not huge figures, but again, should be relatively easily accessible. Moving on from that, the advanced level, which isn't available this year, will be available most likely in 2023. We're yet to hear on that, but there's been a heavy suggestion that no-till will be rewarded through that, which obviously, you know, some farmers will be more geared up for. But I think as it stands at the moment, you know, from a profitability wise, we're not talking about huge sums of money. Are they going to cover the loss of BPS or the reduction in the BPS? Yes, perhaps in the first couple of years, but certainly not, you know, when we get 2 or 3 years into the reduction. And likewise, from a management point of view, most should be able to meet those management requirements. Certainly, you know, in the early rollout SFI, when it comes on board fully in 2024, we'll have to wait and see the options, and the payment rates will no doubt be changed at that stage.
I think I wouldn't really have much to add to that, Sam, really. I think it's interesting that, you know, DEFRA, George Eustace and everyone have always talked about ELM as being an evolution, not a revolution. And I think really the same could probably be said for its effect on farm businesses over the next few years, in that, yes, it'd be for some whose practices already fit quite well with those standards that are coming in early. As you said, Sam, it'd be a nice additional payment to have, but probably not going to be a life-changing amount of money. But it will be interesting to see whether those payment rates evolve as the BPS decreases, as well as the standards themselves expanding and more options becoming available. I think the other thing just to say with SFI is that they are talking about SFI as this kind of broad and shallow level, which you can then layer your local nature recovery on top of that, which is more what they're saying is the equivalent of current mid-tier, higher tier countryside stewardship schemes. So I think they will always set those SFI payments at a lower level, with a view to people then topping that up with additional payments through local nature recovery, in a way that you have to obviously find a way to fit that around your farming system, and that'd be different for everybody. But I think from their point of view, they wouldn't want to make SFI so attractive that nobody's then drawn to look for that extra layer and do a little bit of additional work to gain additional payments.
Can I just jump in as well? I think from being the cynical old sage in the corner, I would be looking at treating SFI and ELMS full stop as a profit center in its own right, and comparing what you can actually get from it net of costs, because a lot of these options that we're looking at are going to actually incur costs, unlike the old BPS scheme where you basically filled a form in and you got your money. A lot of these are actually going to incur costs to actually receive, for you to be able to obtain the payment in the first place. And the reality is understanding your farm and understanding your fields, and actually try to work out whether it actually is going to be more economically viable for you to continue to farm an area, or whether it is actually more economically viable for you to, and I'm being very flippant here, putting it into wildflowers. So I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be needing to try and understand their land a lot better than they probably do at the moment, so that when these opportunities do present themselves over the next few years, you can actually say, actually, that part of that field, I either need it to be consistently doing 4 tons an acre for it to actually continue to be in cropping, or I can't, or it's better off going into wildflowers. And if you can't achieve that, it goes into wildflowers, because that's going to be the economically sensible thing for you to do. So it's actually probably looking at trying to find, or trying to actually understand your land and work out where the land is that is actually worthwhile continue to crop, and actually work out which areas are more economic for you to obtain payments under SFI or local nature recovery, or whatever it might be. In very simple terms, I could literally see the best part of the field, the best rectangle in the center of the field actually being farmed, and farmed very efficiently, and the bits around the edge being managed in some form of environmental option. And that's being very simplistic, but hopefully you can sort of understand where I'm coming from.
Yes, no, thank you for that. Okay, well, shall move on. As a tenant farmer, where can I expect rents to go over the next few years, considering the BPS reduction? I'd like to answer that one.
I'll have a go anyway. BPS is only one part of the equation. The reality is when you're looking at the what rent you are due to pay, it's down to the income earning capacity of the farm. And yes, the BPS is going down. And if we were having this conversation probably 18 months ago, you would actually say probably that it's highly likely that the rents might well be heading downwards. But the reality of the situation is the fact that the margins from most enterprises at the moment are considerably stronger than they were 18 months, 2 years ago. So when you look at those and you add those up and do your budgets, the actual BPS is actually is less significant than it has been over the last, or the majority of the time it's been in operation. And so the reality is, if commodity prices and margins from farming activities remain strong, then the rents are unlikely to go down. If anything, there might be some upward pressure, but if the fertilizer price, the forecast for the future fertilizer price, everyone is expecting that to remain high, and we're probably not going to see £300 a tonne for a number of years now. If that's going to stay high, if fuel's going to stay high, if labour's prices are going up, well then that's all going to impact on the overall margin. But if the bottom line, commodity prices, if they stay high, that is probably not going to actually have a particularly significant downward effect on rents.
I'd echo that, Robert, as well. I think I think there could well be some upward pressure in certain sectors, dairy, arable, rather than downwards. And I suppose, will there be a difference in if you look back at our model farms, and the beef and sheep model, lowland model, is the one that shows the lowest return? That's going to be the business that would struggle to pay the rents first, I suspect. But equally, landlords will be looking on the other side to see what alternatives they've got, potentially are there stewardship options and those kind of things. So it'll come back to supply and demand economics, as you said, Robert, and all of those other factors that go into determining what rents are in a particular area.
Thank you very much. Moving on, I am not currently in an environmental scheme. Should I apply for a countryside stewardship this spring or wait to see what the Sustainable Farming Incentive early rollout will offer? Now that question is an interesting question. It is a question I have had off several clients that aren't currently in an environmental scheme. What I would suggest to anybody and asking me that question is that countryside stewardship offers a diverse range of management options suitable for all types of businesses. There's a whole host of options that you can sort of access with that, a number of which will not be available in the early rollout of the SFI scheme. So I would certainly suggest for anybody that is thinking about trying to get into the environmental schemes to look at stewardship this spring for definite. That will be an application that you would put in for an agreement to start on the 1st of January 2023. What I would then suggest doing is looking at, as soon as we know a little bit more about the early rollout scheme, as Sam alluded to before, a good proportion of the arable soil standard you should be able to access without changing management practices. What that may pose is an opportunity there to lump sort of an SFI early rollout scheme in the business mix as well as a stewardship, which will then give you sort of maximise the options basically, and it'll give you some time securing a stewardship to sort of, if you are a little bit concerned about the early rollout, it'll give you some time to sort of assess, see the options and see what's going to be sort of financially viable and what's going to be financially most profitable going forward. So that would be my sort of suggestions. Most certainly look at stewardship in the spring and then keep a very close eye on the early rollout of the Sustainable Farming Incentive. I don't know whether anybody else has anything to sort of add to that. Sam is waving.
Make sure I'm unmuted this time. Yeah, Josh, I'd take the same approach as you and just add, DEFRA have been fairly open with the fact that if you were to go into a 5-year countryside stewardship scheme, you know, in the next couple of years, and something better was to come along within that period, you would be able to move on to a new scheme unpenalised. So you certainly won't be, you know, find yourself halfway through a countryside stewardship scheme, kicking yourself, thinking, you know, I wish I had waited. You will be able to move forward onto something if you deem it more appropriate for the farm.
Thank you.
I just the only thing I'd add to that, and I completely agree with both answers, but would be that the capital works side of it as well as another reason to look at the countryside stewardship this year, and maybe even if you're not interested in the kind of the mid-tier or high-tier schemes, to look at capital only grants as well. You know, they can be quite a useful way of looking at boundary works and infrastructure works if you're in the right water quality areas, but also they could provide a way of preparing you the SFI and ELM going forwards as well, in that we suspect, looking at the kind of draft standards for things like the hedgerow standards and things under SFI, that to access those higher advanced level payments, you have to be kind of going in with hedgerows, for example, that are already in good condition, you know, that aren't just all gaps and lollipops, and that have quite good standard hedgerow trees here and there. And it's looking at you know, bringing them up to that condition now, I think be a worthwhile investment, so that you can go into SFI at that higher level when it becomes available, rather than having to work your way up over a number of years. So yeah, I completely agree that it's worth looking at, and the capital grants as well you can do as a standalone 2-year grant scheme if that's better suited to your situation.
Good. Okay, we shall move on. Again, another sort of question relating to ELM slightly. Aside from ELM, what other grant funding may be available for the agricultural sector in the future? Sam, would you like to kick off with this one? No, he wouldn't. He's gone. He's back.
No, that was a technical problem on my part. I'll have to hold my with that one. Yeah, I'll have a go, Josh. Thank you. Yeah, so currently at the moment there's a couple of other things available that have been promoted in the press. Recently, the Farming Innovation Fund, that was sort of came out the other in 2021. Likewise, the Farming Investment Fund, which has had good uptake again, that was split into two parts, or is split into two parts rather. The Farming Equipment and Technology Fund, which was sort of otherwise known as the small grant in previous years. The window for that is currently closed for this application window, but is likely to come forward again. So that was for things such as, your sheep handling equipment, direct drills, end sensors, etc. The other part of the Farming Investment Fund is the Farming Transformation Fund. Lots of nice names to remember. That's split into three sections: water management, farming productivity, and adding value. Now, the water management element of that, or certainly the eligibility checker, has closed already. The Farming Productivity Fund is available as we speak, and the Adding Value Fund will be coming forward very soon. DEFRA have said early 2022, so that should be just around the corner. Aside from, and they'll be sort of the bigger grants. We're talking of sort of sums available between 35,000 and £500,000 at a 40% intervention rate. So the bigger projects. On top of that, not that it's available yet, shared prosperity should be coming forwards, and that will be more based on the diversification projects. So whilst the Farming Investment Fund is certainly around farming enterprises, the shared prosperity will be more so diversification, so potentially glamping, farm shops, whatever that might be. But we've yet to see the detail on that. And then, as Greg alluded to earlier, we'll hopefully have the slurry investment scheme coming forward later this year, and then obviously through BPS, again waiting on more detail. There's a bit of a common theme here on lump sum payments, new entrant opportunities, and as we've just said in as part of the last question, countryside stewardship continues, and SFI should be coming available in its sort of early stages this year, with other elements of ELM being piloted as well. If anyone else can think of any others, please shout up.
I'll add a couple more to the list if you want. For those people who are in the farming and protected landscapes areas, that is continuing to roll on until March 24. The window isn't shutting now, so it's going to carry on rolling forward. So if you can type it in online, farming in protected landscapes, and it will show you the maps of the certain areas of where the AOMBs are in the national parks. And then on top of that, I did have another one and I've forgotten it off the top of my head, but that was the main one. The English Woodland Creation Offer, that was the other one I was thinking of. So Woodland Grants are still available too.
Perfect, thank you very much. I think that's sort of covered everything that's in the pipeline. So it's a bit of a watch this space, but some positive news otherwise. Okay, another question we have. Should I be getting a carbon audit done for my farm? If so, which calculator is the best? Holly's smiling.
Yeah, happy to take this one. I mean, there might be some people who are already under pressure to have a carbon audit done for various reasons. There's a lot of the major retailers now, some of the processors and other big buyers are looking at their supply chains and wanting to have a good handle on what the carbon position is amongst all their producers. So it might be that you're already being asked to do a carbon audit, and in that case you probably are being told which calculator to use as well. And for others it might just be the case that they can see that coming on the horizon, that maybe they know that there's going to be a net zero target, and so they want to get ahead of that. And I think that's it's probably wise, that you can then start looking at that on your own terms, and seeing how that might apply to your business. If anybody's interested in carbon markets, I would strongly suggest that you do your carbon audit of your own farm and get a handle on that before you look to sell any carbon off farm. So for example, if you're interested in the soil carbon markets, soil carbon code is hopefully going to emerge over the course of this year in some form. It might be quite a pilot form, but be interesting to see what happens with that. But before you jump to kind of look to sell carbon credits potentially to third parties, you want to be confident that you've got the ability to balance your own emissions on farm and reach that net zero position. So what you don't want to happen is in a few years' time, you know, for someone to come along and say that farming businesses have to be net zero, and you find yourself in a position where you've already sold those credits off farm, and the sequestration potential that you might have had in your woodlands, your hedgerows, your soils, you can't then use that to balance your own emissions. I'd also say that it can be quite an interesting exercise in its own right. It's quite an interesting kind of proxy for efficiency, in that often the emissions that you're looking at are coming from your inputs, you know, whether that's fuel or feed, for instance. So it can highlight areas where actually not making best use or most efficient use of those. And so it's kind of a different lens through which to see that efficiency measures for your business as well. In terms of the best calculators, there's a lot out there at the moment. I'd say the two front runners for me are AgriCalc and the Farm Carbon Toolkit. They've both got their strengths and weaknesses. AgriCalc takes a more kind of enterprise by enterprise approach, for instance, whereas Farm Carbon Toolkit's looking much more across the whole business and takes into account, you know, activities in your office and embedded emissions in your buildings and things. So part of that depends on what you're looking for out of your audits to which one I'd go for. But once you've picked one, stick with it, because year on year you want to be able to compare how you're doing, and if you're using different calculators every time, it's not a fair comparison if you kind of progress over time.
Perfect, thank you very much for that one, Holly. Time for a couple more. What are my options if I haven't bought any nitrogen fertilizer yet for my arable crops?
I'll take that one, Josh. Thank you. What are the options? Obviously, nitrogen fertilizer is still available to purchase at a very high price. That being said, as the figures showed back in the model farms, and Josh sort of briefly alluded to the break-even ratio, it does still make economic sense to apply the vast majority of your sort of normal fertilizer to arable, to arable crops. Taking wheat as an example, if you're selling wheat at £200 a ton, the break-even ratio, even at ammonium nitrate at around that £600 a ton mark, would still be suggesting that the vast majority, that it does still make financial sense to apply your normal amount of fertilizer, whether that be 200, 220 kilos, because the wheat price is high. Now, obviously, that is dependent on the wheat price being high and staying high when you sell all of your grain. But the point is, it does still make sense to put on the vast majority of your nitrogen fertilizer onto crops at these current prices. Other options, I suppose, looking forward into the spring, if you've got some spring cropping to do, go down the legume route, beans, peas that don't have a nitrogen requirement. Therefore, you take it out of the equation. And actually, with crops like that, you'll probably see a pesticide cost reduction as well, and that's another input that will no doubt be going up this spring. Other options, we will likely see more organic manure being applied to standing crops early, where legislation and conditions allow. We're already having talks with various farmers who have got surplus manure, and people are already asking for it, and they're saying, how much should we be charging for this? Should the price per ton of manure be going up, or per cube of slurry be going up, because it'll be sought after, and there are farmers out there who are looking at the alternatives, that being one of them. But as I say, going back to my initial point, it does still make financial sense to be putting ammonium nitrate on crops at good levels, even at £600 a ton. Yes, it's not ideal, and we'd like it to be less, but it does still stack up. And just another point on that, given where we are, nearly the end of January, depending on what the weather does, some crops might be starting to look for that fertilizer in the not too distant future. Getting it on farm will be a big thing as well. Rob, I don't know whether you'd add anything else to that.
Yeah, I think the logistics is actually probably more important than worrying about trying to find, say, the £10 a tonne or whatever it might turn out to be on the fertilizer. The fertilizer market is the fertilizer market, but actually the issue of haulage, which isn't just related to farming, it's across the whole of the economy, is a greater issue. So if you don't actually commit to some tonnage soon, you might well find that the crops are needing it and you haven't got it, and then you're in trouble. So that probably be my one other point to really emphasise is, if you haven't done it, you probably need to do something. You probably need to do something pretty darn smart or quick as well.
Perfect, thank you. We've had another one come in. With carbon becoming more and more important, what are the risks of agriculture not being able to compete for land when other industries look to UK land to sequester carbon? Will land become rent-free if the landlords have already sold the carbon credits, or will it just be planted with trees and lost to production? Opportunity or risk? Who would like to pick that one up?
Sounds like a Holly one to me.
It's a big question.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts to that question. I think the question of not being able to compete for land, I think that comes back to what Rob was saying earlier, really, about looking at land and thinking about land use kind of a bit more strategically going forward. So not just looking at what land you've always farmed in it, or used in a certain way because that's the way you've always done it, but maybe looking at it with fresh eyes and saying which bits can I farm profitably and which bits might be better suited to an alternative enterprise. Because as Rob said, that is, in the end of the day, that's how you need to treat these new opportunities. They need to stack up, they need to have that business case behind them, just as any other new enterprise would on your farm. If the question of kind of land losing value, whether that's rental value or otherwise, if the carbon credits have already been sold, I think that's a really interesting one. I think, particularly with the way that the carbon codes are working at the moment, if you look at Woodland carbon code and things, then it is a kind of, you get one shot at selling the carbon. And if you've sold all the carbon ahead of time, and, then yes, potentially that could impact on the value, but I don't know yet how they will look at the soil carbon, and there are challenges to that approach as well, even with the carbon codes. So it'd be interesting to see how that evolves over time. And as we've talked about earlier with rent levels and things, it's a very complicated picture as to what feeds into land values, and carbon might fall one factor in that, but at the moment, a small factor. That's
Can I just nip in there? One thing that I would say is, if you've sold your carbon credits or whatever, you've probably actually committed to farming the land in a certain way to actually maintain those credits. So in terms of the rent, if that person is not able to farm continue to farm the land in the way, he might well then be looking at someone to actually farm it for him, but they would have to adhere to whatever the requirements are. So if they basically are saying, well, the land is being managed under a no-till system, a no-till system will be how it's having to be managed. And it might well actually end up that not just you get the land for nothing, it might well be eventually that they might actually end up having to pay someone to farm it to ensure that they actually maintain the actual requirements for the carbon credits. So it's going to be it's one area that I'm actually concerned about, is the fact that if you jump too soon, might you actually be committing yourself or that land to something that you don't necessarily want to do for the next 30 years, or you might be happy to do it now, but are you still prepared to do the same thing 10 years, 20 years down the line? So I might be being a little bit pessimistic there, but it's just something to bear in mind when you're looking at the pound notes floating in front of your eyes. You might well have to do stuff for the next 30 years that might make it less appealing over time.
Perfect, thank you. I think we'll probably draw the questions to a close for now. We haven't managed to ask all of the questions, so if you would like to sort of get in touch with us via email or telephone, we'd be more than happy to answer any further questions anybody does have. So if I'd like to hand back to Robert to just bring it all to a close.
Lovely. One thing that we didn't actually talk about, or Sam didn't talk about in terms of all the various other schemes around, is one of the things that we, GSC Grays, are involved in is called the Future Farming Resilience Fund. This is a pot of money that's been made available by DEFRA to actually help farming businesses transition through the agricultural transition plan. We are acting as subcontractors to the AHDB to undertake this work. And as you can see on the screen, there's actually 4 different levels of work. The majority of the time and funding is in level 1, where we're undertaking an assessment of the farm business. This is actually at no cost to a farming business. Well, I'm saying it's no cost. Might be a bit of their time and a cup of coffee in my instance. But other than that, there is no actual financial cost to the business. And we basically come onto farm and look at the actual impact on the BPS reductions on the business, how resilient the business is to this change, and trying to work out where they might be able to do things better. As a result of that initial assessment, there are various opportunities for people to look at taking on, obtaining more free advice. One element is actually the farm bench data set, where it basically helps you start recording data in maybe a better way to enable you to make better decisions. One that we are coming across on a fairly regular basis is undertaking a more in-depth agribusiness appraisal, again, which is very much tailored to the actual individual business. Again, that is free of charge to a certain degree. It depends on what the actual level of work that needs to be undertaken there. And the final element is a carbon audit for those who might be interested in that side of looking at the impact on carbon on their business. This project is running through until June, but if any farming businesses that are on listening to this webinar would be keen to get involved with that, please pick up the phone to us, send us an email, and we'll happily sort that out for you. And that's really where I'd like to end. Thank you very much to all the speakers, and also Holly as well for having to take all the various questions. We're actually quite a big team. There's 13 of us that cover the north of England, from Alnwick in the north down to Easingwold, shortly to be Boroughbridge in the south. We've got a diverse range of people, ages, experience, knowledge, but we are keen to help all farming businesses out there through this transitional period. And certainly, from my point of view, I think it's going to be absolutely a fascinating 5 or 10 year period and a really exciting time to be involved in farming. So at that point, thank you again for everyone that's been involved, and thank you again for listening. Good night.